They thought they had control. They thought they walked away with their dignity intact. But what if everything they believed about emotional power was wrong? What if the real shift didn't happen when the last word was spoken, but weeks before, in total silence? See, most people misunderstand emotional detachment. They think it's loud, dramatic, full of arguments and slammed doors. But the truth? The most haunting departures are the quiet ones. The ones that leave no scars on the surface, yet echo forever in the mind. This is where Stoic relationships flip the script, where control isn't taken, it's reclaimed. So let me ask you, have you ever been so still, so unfazed, that your absence created more chaos than your presence ever did? That's not a breakup. That's evolution. That's power. That's stoicism in action. Here's the truth. Many people believe detachment means you no longer care. But what if it means you finally care enough about yourself to stop performing for someone who only understood value when it started slipping away? They don't feel your absence at first. That's the illusion. They scroll, post, smile, and think they've moved on. But slowly, a quiet discomfort begins. Something doesn't feel right. Why does everything feel a little more hollow now? That feeling they can't name? That's you? That's the shift. And it didn't start when you left, it started when you stopped explaining yourself. This psychological shift isn't something they'll recognize immediately. And by the time they do, you're too far ahead to be reached. That's the storm they never saw coming. It doesn't crash through the walls of their life. It lingers quietly in the background, eroding their sense of control, presence, and closure. And when that silence starts pressing in, they'll search for something to blame. But deep down, they'll know, it was never about what you did. It was about what you stopped doing. You stopped being available. You stopped being predictable. You stopped orbiting their emotional universe. This is not about revenge. It's about restoration. This is what happens when a man no longer seeks validation from the wrong places. When he turns inward, becomes stoic, grounded, unmoved by the noise around him. He doesn't leave with noise. He leaves with clarity. And that clarity? That's what haunts them. Because it's not just the end, it's the realization that the end already happened before they noticed. So if you've ever wondered how to stop being predictable, how to reclaim your emotional presence with power, how to become the version of yourself that people never forget even in silence, stay with me. Because what's coming next will shift how you see yourself, how you show up, and how you disappear when it's time. Ready to step into the calmest, strongest version of yourself? Then let's begin. 1. The detachment happened first, not the goodbye. They think it started the day you walked away. The day the relationship officially ended. But that's just the timestamp they can hold on to, the visible moment, the last scene in a story they didn't bother reading until it was too late. The truth is, you were already gone long before that. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, energetically. You had been retreating one invisible thread at a time. While they were still playing power games, you were pulling away in silence. No announcement. No confrontation. Just a quiet shift in how you showed up. Or more accurately, how you stopped showing up. That's the part they'll never understand. Because in their world, endings come with noise. With closure. With drama. They expect explosions. But Stoic relationships don't end that way. The shift isn't made of fire, it's made of distance. Subtle. Silent. A complete withdrawal of emotional availability. And the scariest part for them? They didn't even notice it happening until you were already gone. Ask yourself, how many times did you lower your voice just to keep the peace? How many moments did you swallow your own needs just to maintain a connection that no longer fed you? And how long did it take before the weight of pretending to care became heavier than the fear of being alone? See, they thought they still had you because your body was there. Because you still replied? Still showed up, at least on the surface. But every interaction was more mechanical. Every message colder. Every moment more distant. You weren't being rude. You were being real. And that authenticity, Your quiet refusal to fake it was the beginning of the end. Not for you. For them. That's the paradox. While they were still measuring love in texts received and time spent, they didn't realize they were already losing access to the part of you that mattered most: your energy, your attention, your emotional presence. It's easy to blame someone for walking away. It's much harder to take accountability for not noticing when they began to withdraw. But let's go deeper. How does someone lose access to you without even realizing it? Because they mistake physical proximity for connection. They confuse consistency with commitment. They believe your presence is proof you still care. But Stoicism teaches otherwise. Presence without engagement isn't presence, it's a placeholder. And you weren't holding space for them anymore. You were just honoring the process of letting go with grace. They won't admit it, but there were signs. Tiny moments where your silence became louder than your words. Times when you didn't argue, didn't chase, didn't react the way they expected you to. Times when your lack of response said more than any paragraph ever could. But they missed it. Why? Because they were busy looking for emotional fireworks, not noticing the quiet storm building in your stillness. They were watching your lips, not your eyes. They were listening to your words, not your absence of feeling. And by the time they did notice, you had already transitioned from involvement to indifference. That's what haunts them now. Not the breakup, but the realization that the true ending wasn't the one they could point to on a calendar. It was the one they couldn't see happening. Because it occurred in your mind. In your values. In your decision to stop watering a plant that refused to grow. They think you gave up. But you didn't. You simply chose peace over performance. You chose truth over tolerance. And in doing so, you became the version of yourself they never prepared for, a man who no longer needs to explain his exit. Let's pause here. Why do people fear silence more than conflict? Because silence offers no reassurance, no emotional data, no narrative to control. It's ambiguous. And ambiguity breeds anxiety. So when you went silent, not just verbally, but emotionally, they didn't feel rejection. They felt confusion. And that confusion is a slow burn. At first, they think you're just busy, distracted, maybe even playing a game. But then days turn into distance. Distance turns into detachment. And detachment turns into a haunting lack of closure. Now they're spinning. Not because you ended it, but because they don't know when it actually ended. And that mystery becomes their obsession. What moment did you truly check out? Was it during the last argument? The last ignored message? The last time they dismissed your effort? They'll replay the timeline over and over, searching for clues, trying to locate the moment your heart walked out, even though your feet hadn't yet followed. But here's the truth they'll never say out loud. The only reason they didn't see it was because they were too consumed with their own ego to feel your silence. This is the beauty of Stoicism in relationships. It's not reactionary. It's intentional. When a Stoic man detaches, it's not impulsive, it's informed. It's not revenge, it's realization. He doesn't leave to hurt. He leaves because staying became self-betrayal. And when he walks away, it's not to make a statement. It's because he no longer needs to be understood. That shift, the moment when clarity outweighs emotion, is what they'll never recover from. Because you didn't just leave the room. You left the role they had cast you in. And without your emotional presence, their script falls apart. Do you see what's happening now? You're not the one who's lost. You're the one who found peace. You stopped engaging with chaos. Stopped explaining yourself to someone who never listened. Stopped waiting to be seen by someone who only valued what they could control. And in doing so, you reclaimed your self-respect, your emotional sovereignty, your internal stillness. That's not abandonment. That's alignment. And no, they won't understand it. But that's not your responsibility. Because when someone truly detaches with grace and stoic discipline, they don't create closure for others. They become it. And so now they're left with the shadow of who you were. A ghost that doesn't haunt them with noise, but but with the quiet truth that you were gone long before they ever said goodbye. The haunting isn't in your departure. It's in the delay of their recognition. And every time they scroll back, look at old texts, wonder what happened, they're not looking for answers. They're searching for presence that no longer exists. You didn't disappear. You evolved. And in doing so, you became the lesson they'll carry into every future connection without even knowing why it stings. You might ask, was it worth it? The silence, the restraint, the emotional discipline? Let me answer that with a question of my own. What's more powerful than leaving without bitterness? Than choosing to detach not in anger, but in clarity? Than reclaiming your peace and letting the shift speak louder than any argument ever could? That's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's the heart of Stoicism. And in Stoic relationships, the goodbye is never the real ending. The real ending happens in the quiet decision to stop giving what was never truly valued. So let them wonder. Let them search for the moment. Let them scroll, guess, rewrite history. You owe no one an explanation for a peace you fought hard to protect. Because in the stillness, in the absence, in the emotional vacuum you left behind, you became the silence they can't stop hearing. And that silence will haunt them forever. 2. Control collapsed when you stopped reacting. They don't realize how much power they held, not in their words, not in their presence, but in your reactions. That was the currency. Your attention, your emotional availability, your predictable compassion. Every time they pulled back, you leaned in. Every time they created distance, you tried to bridge it. And every time they tested the limits of your patience, you showed up with more. But then something shifted. Slowly. Quietly. Not out of bitterness, not out of resentment, but out of understanding. You realized that the more you reacted, the more control you surrendered. And so, one day you stopped. You didn't announce the shift. You didn't declare war or seek revenge. You just became unavailable. Not physically, but emotionally. No more chasing. No more late-night responses to emotional bait. No more over-explaining yourself to someone who only listened when you started pulling away. Your energy, once constant and reliable, became calm, neutral, unreadable. And that neutrality? That's what shattered their entire emotional framework. They didn't need you to say yes or no. They just needed to know that their behavior still triggered something inside you. That's what gave them power. Your reaction was their validation. Your emotional engagement, even in conflict, told them they still mattered. But Stoicism strips away that illusion. When a man becomes stoic, when he disciplines his responses, when he chooses stillness over volatility, he takes back control of his life. Because true power is not in how loudly you can shout, it's in how little you need to respond. So ask yourself, why did your silence rattle them more than your anger ever did? Why did your calm neutrality feel more dangerous to them than any confrontation? Because without your reactions, they had no compass. No confirmation. No frame to play their emotional games inside. You weren't cold, you were just no longer participating. Here's the truth they don't want to face. Their confidence wasn't built on self-worth. It was built on your dependability. Your willingness to meet them halfway, every time. Even when they were pulling away. They thought they were in control because they could predict your behavior. They believed they held power because every emotional withdrawal from them meant a deeper pursuit from you. But when that pursuit stopped, when your energy became detached, when your responses no longer matched their provocations, they were left exposed. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped playing a role you never agreed to in the first place. It wasn't a game for you. It was real. You showed up. You were consistent. You tried. But once you saw the pattern, how every silence they gave was just a hook for you to speak louder, how every cold shoulder was a test of your loyalty, how every retreat was bait for you to overextend, you woke up. You realized that love isn't supposed to feel like emotional acrobatics. It's not supposed to be a test of how much pain you can endure before you walk away. And so you did the one thing they never expected, you stopped being predictable. And in doing that, you shattered the illusion of their emotional dominance. This is where Stoic relationships become transformative. When you remove your emotional reaction, when you refuse to participate in cycles that lead nowhere, you reclaim your dignity. You show them that the game only works when both people are playing. And you're no longer available for manipulation masked as emotional complexity. You're no longer reachable by silence. You're no longer stirred by passive-aggressive remarks, disappearing acts, or inconsistency. That's not detachment out of hurt, it's detachment out of healing. They'll call you distant. They might even accuse you of changing. But what really changed is your tolerance. Your capacity to be controlled by chaos. You didn't become heartless. You became self-aware. And in their world, that's dangerous. Because it means they can no longer control the outcome. They don't get to decide when you engage. They don't get to dictate the tempo of the relationship by playing hot and cold. And most of all, they don't get to provoke a version of you that you've outgrown. Here's what happens next. They start to panic. Not outwardly at first. It begins subtly. More frequent check-ins. More attempts to read your tone. Testing the waters with emotional breadcrumbs. But the more you remain grounded, the more you stay calm, the more their strategies fall flat. And that's when the unraveling begins. Not because you're doing anything cruel, but because your silence is a mirror. And they don't like what's being reflected back. That reflection forces a new realization. They were never in control. They were just reacting to your reactions. And now that you've stepped out of that dynamic, they're left with nothing to hold on to. No leverage. No emotional access. No familiar patterns. Just stillness. And that stillness? It becomes deafening. Because now every message they send feels like a shot in the dark. Every delayed response from you feels like a shift in power. Every time you choose to stay quiet instead of engage, you remind them that the rules have changed, and they're no longer the ones setting them. People don't fear being ignored. They fear being unreadable. And you've become unreadable. Not because you're playing games, but because you've mastered yourself. You're no longer operating from a place of reactivity. You've aligned with your values, your peace, your clarity. That's the essence of Stoicism. You don't raise your voice to be heard, you lower your energy to be felt. And now they're feeling it in every unanswered call, every calm. Okay. Every delayed or missing response. You've removed their favorite tool, predictability. And without that, they're exposed. Now they begin to question. Not just your silence, but everything. Was it always like this? Did they misread your patience for weakness? Did they mistake your effort for neediness? That's the psychological shift. You didn't just become less available, you became a mystery. You didn't just stop reacting, you became emotionally self-sufficient. And that version of you? That's what they can't handle. Because they don't know how to reach him. He doesn't need validation. He doesn't respond on cue. He doesn't chase confusion. He only engages with clarity. This is the turning point. When they realize that your absence of reaction isn't temporary. It's not a phase. It's your new baseline. Your new standard. You're not just taking space, you're building something within it. And that something is unshakable. You're not looking back. You're not waiting for apologies. You're not seeking understanding. You've made peace with not being understood. And in doing so, you've become what they never saw coming. A man who is fully present within himself and completely absent from their emotional loop. So where does this leave them? In a loop of uncertainty. Every moment of silence from you now feels intentional. Every unbothered reaction feels like distance they can't bridge. They don't miss the old version of you, they miss the emotional safety net you used to provide. They don't grieve your presence, they grieve the control they used to have over your heart. And now, that control is gone. Not because you took it back forcefully, but because you stopped giving it away. They will never say it out loud. But deep down they know. The moment you stopped reacting, they lost access to a version of you that gave them meaning. You didn't change the game. You ended it. And in that ending, you found your beginning. The beginning of Stoic discipline. Of peace that doesn't rely on someone else's chaos. Of presence that doesn't need performance. This is what Stoicism gives you. The ability to hold your own ground when everything around you is designed to knock you off balance. If you're still watching this and it hits something deep, good. That means you're waking up. To your power. To your worth. To your peace. You don't need to argue. You don't need to explain. You just need to remember, your stillness isn't passive. It's powerful. And it's the reason they can't stop thinking about you. Because silence in Stoic relationships is never emptiness, it's presence on your own terms. So if this resonates, like and comment, number 1 below. Let the world know you're done reacting, done chasing, and fully stepping into the version of yourself that no longer moves for confusion. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. This journey isn't about them, it's about you. About becoming. About evolving. And most of all, about finally being seen without ever having to explain again. 3. You became emotionally unreadable. They used to read you like a book. Every text, every pause, every look on your face carried emotional weight that they could decode almost instantly. You were expressive, open, and emotionally available, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. You gave them access not only to your presence but to your internal world. You didn't just respond, you revealed. That made them feel safe, even powerful. Because they always knew where they stood with you. But then, slowly, that emotional clarity began to fade. Not out of malice. Not because you were hiding something. But because you were evolving. Evolving into someone who no longer outsourced his peace for the sake of being understood. You stopped leaking your emotions. You stopped projecting your thoughts into every interaction. You started protecting your energy with a discipline that felt foreign to them. And just like that, the man they once felt so connected to became unreadable. Here's what they didn't anticipate. That silence could be stronger than speech. That emotional neutrality could feel colder than absence. You weren't ignoring them. You were simply no longer broadcasting your emotional state. You stopped giving away free access to your reactions, your mood, your mind. And now they don't know what to do with that. Because the old version of you, the one who over-explained, overextended, overcared, is gone. And in his place stands someone calm, deliberate, stoic. Someone who listens more than he speaks, who watches without reacting, who chooses when and how to reveal himself with intention, not habit. They begin to question everything. Not because you're being cruel, but because they can't interpret you anymore. And for someone who once thrived on emotional predictability, that's terrifying. They send a message and get a one-word reply. Not cold, just flat. They try to pick a fight, and you don't bite. They test your emotions, and you give them nothing but composed stillness. It's not detachment they fear, it's ambiguity. Because ambiguity makes them feel powerless. They can't draw you into emotional chaos if they don't know where you stand. They can't provoke you if you don't engage. And they can't control the narrative if you refuse to give them emotional material to work with. Let's be clear, you didn't become unreadable by accident. You became unreadable because you finally understood the power of self-control. This is the path of Stoicism. Not repressing emotion, but mastering it. Choosing your expression with wisdom. Protecting your inner world not with walls, but with discernment. You don't owe anyone access to your thoughts simply because they demand a reaction. And once you stop giving those reactions, they don't know who you are anymore. The mask they thought you wore wasn't a mask, it was transparency. And now that transparency has been replaced with discretion. Ask yourself, how many times did you share your feelings only to be met with manipulation, indifference, or twisted interpretations? How often did your emotional openness become ammunition for someone else's control? It wasn't vulnerability that broke you, it was the way they treated it. And now, your silence isn't retaliation. It's reclamation. Of dignity. Of clarity. Of peace. You're not unavailable. You're just no longer accessible to people who haven't earned the right to your emotional landscape. That distinction is what changed everything. So now, every attempt they make to pull you into old dynamics fails. Not because you've hardened, but because you've healed. You used to argue for your value. Now you let your absence speak for itself. You used to try to clarify misunderstandings. Now you let confusion run its course. You used to explain your intentions. Now your silence does the explaining. They don't understand it, and they won't. Because they're looking for the version of you that was always emotionally present, even when it was costing you your sanity. But that version no longer exists. He evolved. And in that evolution, he became unreadable. Unreadable doesn't mean emotionless. It means your emotions are no longer on display for those who mishandled them. It means you've trained yourself to respond, not react. To observe without absorbing. To feel without spilling. That level of emotional maturity isn't common, it's rare. And it's intimidating to people who rely on others to feel secure. Because now, they're left with a version of you they can't manipulate, predict, or control. That's what Stoic relationships demand, emotional autonomy. And now you've claimed it. Think about this. They used to initiate chaos and you'd come running with clarity. Now they stir the same chaos and you respond with calm. They used to disappear and you'd chase. Now they go quiet and you stay quieter. They used to provoke and you'd explain. Now they provoke and you observe. That stillness? That's your power. That unreadability? That's your evolution. It forces them to sit with their own noise. To confront their own confusion. And for people who depend on external emotional engagement to feel centered, your silence is psychological warfare. But again, this isn't about games. It's about growth. You didn't become unreadable to punish anyone. You became unreadable to protect yourself. Because every time you made yourself emotionally transparent in the past, someone used that transparency as leverage. Now, instead of venting your thoughts, you process them. Instead of revealing your plans, you execute them. Instead of sharing your every doubt, you reflect on them privately. That's not withdrawal. That's strength. That's stoicism. And that's why they're unsettled. They'll never say it out loud, but they miss the version of you that bled emotion. The one who was easy to read, easy to push, easy to stir. The one who responded at every trigger, who tried to fix every miscommunication, who apologized even when confused. But that man no longer lives here. In his place stands a man who has mastered emotional discipline, who no longer allows others to dictate his peace, who doesn't abandon his calm just because someone else refuses to regulate their chaos. Now, every time they interact with you, they second-guess themselves. Was that a subtle dig? Was that indifference or just peace? Are you angry or just at ease? They can't tell. Because you're not providing context anymore. You used to color everything with tone and explanation. Now you're black and white. Not cruel. Just clear. That clarity isn't harsh, it's precise. And that precision? That's the mental edge you now walk with. That's what makes you unforgettable. Because here's the twist. They may move on, talk to others, even find someone new. But no one will feel quite like you. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. And now you're gone, not in distance, but in transparency. They don't get to read you anymore. Don't get to access your vulnerability. Don't get to predict your every emotional move. You're not on their radar, and that's why they're still haunted. They don't miss the connection. They miss the control. They don't miss your presence. They miss the ability to read and redirect it. So what now? You keep going. You stay unreadable. Not out of defense, but out of design. Because you've finally learned that your inner peace isn't up for public consumption. That your growth doesn't require an audience. And that the strongest men aren't the loudest, they're the most emotionally grounded. That's the soul of Stoicism. And it's why Stoic relationships stand out. They don't chase drama, they radiate discipline. Stay with that energy. Keep protecting your emotional space. Don't regress for the sake of familiarity. Let them live in the confusion they created when they mistook your openness for weakness. You didn't close off. You just evolved past needing to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. That's the shift. That's the silence. That's the presence they can no longer decode. And that's what makes it unforgettable. 4. Your absence forced a reckoning. They never really noticed your presence. Not deeply. Not completely. It was always just there. A given. A default setting in their emotional landscape. You were the one who replied quickly. The one who checked in. The one who asked how their day was, even when yours was falling apart. You were steady, consistent, emotionally anchored. You showed up even when you weren't appreciated. And they mistook that presence for permanence. But then you withdrew. Slowly. Without conflict. Without a final speech. You didn't storm out. You simply stopped showing up with the same heart. And suddenly, everything felt different. Not chaotic. Just hollow. They didn't expect that stillness. Because when you were there, they never had to face the consequences of their emotional laziness. They never had to sit with the reality of how unbalanced things had become. But now, in your absence, there's a vacuum. A psychological emptiness they can't fill with distractions. And the more they try to replace you, the more obvious it becomes, your presence wasn't just comforting. It was stabilizing. They thought they were independent. But your absence reveals the truth. They were dependent on your emotional effort to make everything feel safe. Here's what they didn't understand: your attention wasn't passive. It was a choice. A sacrifice. You didn't just listen, you absorbed. You didn't just show up, you carried. And now that you're gone, the weight of all the things you used to hold is pressing down on them. Quietly. Powerfully. The things they said, the things they didn't say. The way they disregarded your emotional labor. The way they assumed you'd always be there, no matter how much they pulled back. That's what haunts them now. Not the fight. Not the goodbye. The realization that your absence isn't just silence, it's confrontation. This is what Stoicism in relationships teaches us. True detachment isn't about giving up. It's about growing up. When you leave someone not with a slam but with serenity, they don't get the satisfaction of conflict. They don't get the emotional closure of anger. They're left with reflection. With all the questions they never had to ask when you were there to buffer their self-awareness. And now, every moment alone forces them to sit with what they ignored. You didn't disappear. You just stopped enabling their comfort with your effort. Ask yourself, how many times did you forgive without being asked? How many times did you explain the same boundary over and over, only to be ignored? How many times did you prioritize their emotional storms over your own calm? And when did you realize that the only way to reclaim your peace was to remove yourself from the equation entirely? That's the reckoning. Not just for them, for you. You had to face the truth that being available to someone who doesn't value you is the fastest way to become invisible. And so you left. Not in anger, but in awareness. Now they're sitting in that awareness. And it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like exposure. Because your absence stripped away their illusions. It revealed how much of their stability was built on your silent strength. They didn't see it then. But they feel it now. The calls you no longer make. The messages you no longer send. The small daily acts of care that are now gone. And the hardest part? They can't replicate it. Because what you gave wasn't ordinary. It was rare. Built from discipline, selflessness, and a depth they didn't know they'd miss until it was gone. There's a lesson in that silence. A weight. A truth. That attention is a gift. That presence is a privilege. And that when someone offers you both freely, it's not because they have nothing better to do, it's because they choose you. But choices can change. Especially when one person is doing all the choosing. You got tired. Not of them. But of what you became around them. A version of yourself that tolerated more than he should have. That gave more than he got. That stayed long after he stopped feeling seen. So now, in your absence, they begin the process you already completed. Reflection. But reflection without access to you is a one-way mirror. They see their mistakes, but they don't get to fix them. They feel the loss, but they don't get to reach for comfort. And that's the difference. You had to reflect while still showing up. They have to reflect with nothing but echoes. That's not revenge. That's reality. And it's the reality Stoicism helps you accept, that sometimes, the only way to teach someone your value is to remove it. This is the power of silence. Not as a punishment, but as a mirror. They can't argue with your words if you're not speaking. They can't twist your intentions if you've stopped explaining. They can't negotiate with your absence. It just is. And in that space, they feel the full weight of who you were. Not just the good moments, but the ones where they failed to show up. The ones where they mistook your kindness for weakness. The ones where they tested your patience because they believed it was endless. That's the reckoning. Not the loss of you, but the confrontation with the way they treated you. They'll try to distract themselves. With new people. With busyness. With noise. But silence has a way of finding cracks. Of slipping into the quiet moments. Late at night. Early in the morning. When the notifications stop and the faces disappear. That's when they hear it. The echo of what they took for granted. The rhythm of your consistency. The memory of how safe your presence felt, even if they never admitted it. They'll wonder where it went. Why it doesn't feel the same with anyone else. Why the new attention feels empty. And that wondering will become a loop they can't close. But you're not in that loop. You've moved past the need to be understood. You're not watching their stories. You're not checking their page. You're not hoping for a text. You're building. Evolving. Grounding yourself in a peace that doesn't need external validation. That's Stoicism in action. The ability to let go, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about the right things. About your growth. Your energy. Your path. This isn't about proving them wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you can walk away from anything that costs you your self-respect. That your emotional discipline isn't conditional. That you're not just calm when things are easy, you're grounded when things are difficult. That's the mark of emotional maturity. And it's what separates a man who reacts from a man who leads himself. They might reach out. They might test the waters. But you'll know. You'll feel it. The pull to explain, to fix, to go back. And you'll let it pass. Because you've already faced the hard part, the letting go. And now, every day you don't return to old patterns is another day you become more of who you were meant to be. That's not loss. That's liberation. So if you're in that phase where your absence is being felt, stay there. Don't go back just because they're finally starting to reflect. Their reckoning is not your responsibility. Their confusion is not your burden. Your only job now is to stay true to the version of yourself that chose peace over performance. That version is powerful. That version is stoic. That version is unforgettable. If this part spoke to you, take a moment to like and comment, number 1 below. Let it be known that your absence isn't a tactic, it's a turning point. And don't forget to subscribe for more insights on Stoic relationships, emotional clarity, and reclaiming your power without saying a word. Your growth isn't a phase, it's a standard. Stay grounded. Stay silent. Stay you. 5. You turned into a standard no one else can match. At first, they think replacing you will be easy. There's always someone new to talk to, someone new to like their photos, someone ready to say the right things. The world is full of fresh attention, isn't it? They move on. Or at least that's what it looks like on the surface. New conversations, new stories, new distractions. But underneath it all, something doesn't quite click. Something doesn't land. And they can't figure out why. Because it all feels so familiar, yet not the same. That's when it starts. The comparison. Not conscious at first. Just a subtle tension. A sense that something's missing. That something is you. Not just as a person, but as an experience. They didn't realize what they had because you were always consistent. Always present. always grounded. And they mistook that stability for simplicity. But now, in the noise of surface-level connections, they feel the contrast. You weren't perfect, but you were rare. You didn't just show up, you stayed present. You didn't perform, you showed depth. And now, every interaction that lacks those things feels empty. That emptiness isn't about loneliness, it's about the absence of emotional substance. You gave them that. Not with words, but with how you carried yourself. How you handled conflict. How you listened without judgment and led with calm. That was your standard. And now, nothing else feels right. This is the unspoken power of Stoic relationships. You didn't try to be unforgettable. You simply lived by principles that most don't even recognize. Self-control, patience, respect, clarity. You weren't chasing validation, so you never overextended. You weren't afraid of silence, so you never filled the space with drama. You didn't react, you responded. You weren't always loud, but your energy spoke volumes. And that energy? It lingered. Now that it's gone, they're starting to see it for what it truly was, presence with purpose. They'll talk to someone new, and at first, it might feel exciting. But over time, excitement fades, and depth becomes the new requirement. And that's where things fall apart. Because the kind of depth you offered can't be faked. It can't be replicated through charm or surface-level intimacy. It's built over time. Through character. Through consistency. Through an internal calm that only comes from someone who's done the work. And you've done the work. That's why you're different. They didn't understand the value of your silence until they found someone who couldn't handle theirs. They didn't appreciate your patience until they were met with impulsiveness. They didn't honor your clarity until they stepped into confusion. Everything they once overlooked now shines in contrast. Every time a new person shows up and can't match your steadiness, your standard becomes more pronounced. It becomes the lens through which they judge every other interaction. Not because you're perfect, but because you were genuine. And that's what no one else has brought to the table since. This is the echo you leave behind. Not because you tried to haunt them, but because your presence was the kind that carved out space in their psychology. A space now left unfilled. It's not about ego. It's about energy. You gave without attachment. You loved with awareness. You walked away without making a scene. And that kind of composure? That's what turns a person into a memory that lives quietly, but deeply, in someone's mind. Now, even when they're laughing with someone new, something feels off. The jokes don't land the same way. The conversations lack depth. The emotional rhythms feel out of tune. Because what they had with you wasn't performative. It was real. They might never say it. They might never admit it, not even to themselves. But it's there. The comparison. The internal standard that every new person gets measured against. And it's not just what you did, it's who you were while doing it. Think about this. How many times did you show up even when you weren't met halfway? How many times did you choose calm in the face of chaos? How often did you keep your word without having to be reminded? That's the substance most people miss. Because they don't see the value in a stoic man until they're surrounded by impulsive ones. Until they meet someone who talks big but can't deliver. Until they realize that silence isn't always absence, sometimes it's power. And that power doesn't come from needing to be needed. It comes from knowing who you are. You never needed to compete. You never had to raise your voice to be felt. You didn't win them with performance. You won them with presence. And now that presence is gone. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, energetically. They can't touch it anymore. And what they don't realize is, they help create the distance they now mourn. That's what Stoicism gives you, the ability to detach not out of coldness, but out of clarity. The discipline to walk away when your peace is compromised. The strength to lead with silence instead of seeking reassurance. That's what made you different. And that's what makes you unforgettable. Because in a world of noise, you offered stillness. In a world of chaos, you were calm. In a world of games, you were grounded. And that contrast? It never leaves them. Even now, as time passes, your name might not come up. But your energy does. Every time they feel uncertain with someone new, they remember your stability. Every time they feel overlooked, they remember your attention. Every time they feel confused, they remember your clarity. You became a standard, not because you tried to be, but because you were fully yourself. And that self was rare. That's the haunting part. They can't unfeel you. They can't replace you. They can only carry the memory of what it felt like to be known, seen, and respected by someone who never needed to prove anything. So they scroll. They search. They swipe. But nothing lands the same way. Because you're not just a name. You're a feeling. You're a benchmark. You're a presence they took for granted, and now can't stop comparing others to. That's the psychological imprint of a Stoic relationship. It doesn't end when you walk away. It begins. In their thoughts. In their decisions. In every future connection they try to build, using the blueprint you left behind. This is your quiet revenge, if you can call it that. Not rooted in bitterness, but in becoming. In evolving so deeply that your absence feels more profound than any speech could ever be. They didn't lose you when you left. They lost you when they failed to appreciate what you brought when you were there. And now, every moment of silence from you echoes louder than anything they've heard since. That's what happens when you stop being accessible and start becoming aligned. And no, they'll never say it out loud. Pride won't let them. But they know. Every time they laugh but don't feel understood. Every time they connect but don't feel safe. Every time they're seen but not truly known. They remember. Not you, the image, but you, the experience. And that experience set a standard no one else has been able to match. That's the power of stillness. Of emotional discipline. Of stoicism in action. And it's why you don't need to come back. You already left your mark. Quietly. Permanently. 6. Their fantasy of control has no ending now. They thought they had time. They thought they had options. They thought they had control, not just over the story, but over you. That even if things ended, the emotional door would remain slightly open. That they could leave, wander, explore other attention, and still come back to your presence when it suited them. To them, you were always one message away. One call away. One moment of emotional panic away from returning. But then, you didn't come back. You didn't chase. You didn't even flinch. You moved on, not just in appearance, but in energy. And that, more than anything, shattered the illusion. They believed the narrative was theirs to direct. That they could decide when the tension rose and when the resolution came. But you refused to play that role anymore. You stopped being part of the emotional feedback loop they depended on. And suddenly, the story was no longer in their hands. That's where the panic begins. Not because you yelled or blocked them or made a scene, but because you stepped off the stage entirely. And now the play keeps going without a lead. This is where Stoic relationships flip the script. Because Stoicism teaches that real control isn't loud. It isn't reactive. It isn't in chasing or correcting narratives. It's in walking away with peace. With presence. With self-mastery. You didn't just stop playing their game, you burned the rulebook. And they didn't expect that. Because every time before you reacted. You returned. You explained. But now you're gone in a way they can't reach. Not because they can't find you, but because the version of you they knew no longer exists. That's what haunts them. The permanence of your shift. The stability of your absence. The completeness of your detachment. Because it wasn't performative. It wasn't part of a bigger emotional trick. It was real. You didn't leave to teach a lesson. You left because you learned yours. And that learning came with a cost. A painful realization that someone who never respected your energy doesn't deserve your return. And now, as they sit with the silence, they're beginning to feel the weight of what they lost, not just a relationship, but control. Control is often mistaken for connection. They believed they had both. But in truth, They only had your willingness to remain available. And when you removed that availability, their entire illusion collapsed. They don't know when they lost it, but they feel the loss everywhere. In every unanswered message. In every moment where they expected your presence and got stillness instead. In every second where they tried to push emotional buttons that no longer exist. They'll try to reverse engineer the moment. Was it the last argument? Was it when they ignored your vulnerability? Was it when they thought silence would draw you closer and it only pushed you farther away? They don't know. Because your shift didn't come with a declaration. It came with discipline. And that discipline? It's what makes it permanent. You see, they were banking on your predictability, your loyalty, your emotional openness. That even when things got rough, you'd still be there. That no matter how far they pushed, you'd bend but never break. That was the fantasy. The story where they always got to be the one who decided when and how things ended. But now that you've reclaimed your peace, that fantasy has no conclusion. Because you didn't just exit the relationship, you exited the pattern. Think about how many times you were the one who reached out first. The one who apologized first. The one who tried to make sense of emotional chaos. How many cycles you endured under the illusion that things could be fixed if you just gave more, waited longer, tried harder. But then you woke up. You saw the truth. That control wasn't mutual. That love wasn't reciprocal. That presence wasn't respected. And that clarity? It changed you forever. Now they're left with questions that echo. Questions with no answers. Not because you're withholding, but because there's nothing left to say. You said everything already, with your silence, with your growth, with your refusal to participate in dynamics that no longer serve your evolution. And the more they try to get a response, the louder your non-response becomes. It's not coldness. It's closure. Stoic closure. The kind that doesn't seek revenge or resolution. Just peace. They might even tell themselves they're unbothered. That they moved on. That they're better off. But there's a difference between leaving and letting go. They left. But they didn't let go. You did. That's why the silence haunts them. Not because you're missing, but because your absence says everything they didn't want to hear. That they never had control. That they never really knew you. That the access they enjoyed was a privilege they mistook for permanence. They wanted to believe you were the emotional backup plan. The fallback. The safe place. But Stoic men don't linger where they're not respected. They don't orbit people who abuse their emotional presence. They don't return just because someone else is finally ready to notice what was always there. They move forward. Fully. Completely. Quietly. And now your life is unfolding without their input. That's the real loss. Not the relationship. But the realization that they no longer have a say. They no longer hold space in your story. They can't control the narrative, can't reach into your world, can't shape your direction. They're watching from the outside. And it's not the distance that breaks them, it's the powerlessness. Because control was never about conversation. It was about emotional leverage. And you took that away when you stopped reacting. When you stopped responding. When you stopped offering explanations for your growth. They never saw that coming. Because they didn't believe you could leave without being angry. But you didn't just walk away. You walked away calm. Grounded. Unmoved. And that calmness? That's the sharpest cut. Now, no matter what they do, they can't rewrite the ending. Because the ending wasn't theirs to control. You took that power the moment you chose self-respect over familiarity. The moment you stopped needing to be understood. The moment you chose to become the kind of man who doesn't negotiate his peace for someone else's comfort. So they spiral. Quietly. Publicly pretending all is well. But internally, they're haunted by the shift. The change in rhythm. The way everything they thought they controlled suddenly slipped away. Because you were never theirs to command. You were yours to honor. And now that you've done that, they're left with the reality that control was always just a fantasy. A comfort they created, but never truly owned. If that speaks to you, take a second and like this video. Comment, number 1, if you've reclaimed your peace. And don't forget to subscribe for more content on Stoic relationships, emotional mastery, and walking away with quiet strength. Your story isn't over, it's just beginning. Keep evolving. Keep growing. And never go back to what once made you feel small. There's a silence they'll never escape. A question that will revisit them in the quiet hours, in the middle of laughter that feels too forced, in the presence of someone new who doesn't quite measure up. The shift wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye. It was a calm, resolute detachment that left no door open behind it. And that's what lingers. That's what haunts. Not because you wanted it to, but because that's what truth does, it stays. Long after the noise, long after the masks, long after the distractions wear off. They'll tell themselves stories. Stories to make sense of your silence. They'll call it ego, avoidance, coldness. But none of those labels will stick. Because deep down, they know. They felt the change long before it became final. They just ignored it. Thought you were bluffing. Thought your loyalty would override your clarity. But loyalty without reciprocity is bondage. And you finally broke free, not with anger, but with awareness. You became the one thing they never thought you would be, unavailable. Unavailable to chaos. To emotional inconsistency. To being pulled into cycles you outgrew. You didn't disappear. You recentered. You reclaimed every part of yourself that you gave too freely for too long. And now your energy doesn't orbit anyone, it stands. On its own. Unshaken. Quiet. Complete. That's the highest expression of Stoicism. Not in how you detach from others, but in how you return to yourself. There will be moments when you remember them too. That's inevitable. You're not stone, you're human. You'll think of a laugh, a message, a moment. But you won't miss them. You'll miss who you were when you believed you were being loved right. You'll miss your own sincerity. Your own optimism. But now you see that even those pieces of you were being misused, misread, or mishandled. And now you guard them, not out of fear, but out of respect. You don't need to be closed off to be safe. You just need to be selective. Because not everyone who wants access deserves it. Not everyone who wants your presence has earned the right to hold it. And that's not bitterness, that's clarity. A man who is grounded in Stoicism doesn't need to explain his distance. His silence is not emptiness. It's structure. His stillness is not absence. It's strength. Now they live with echoes. And every one of those echoes carries a question. Why does it still hurt if they're the one who left? Because they didn't just lose you. They lost access to a version of you they never truly saw. A version that showed up with love, with presence, with effort. And by the time they realized the rarity of that version, it was gone. That's the part they'll never be able to name, but they'll always feel. In the spaces they move through now, nothing will feel the same. Not because you cursed them, but because you set a bar they didn't realize they'd struggle to meet again. You didn't just become a memory. You became a measure, a standard, a turning point. And the further you go, the more they'll feel left behind, not by time, but by growth. Your growth. Because you didn't just detach, you transformed. This isn't just about relationships. It's about everything. How you show up for yourself. How you move. How you lead. How you choose peace without needing permission. You're not chasing closure because you've become it. You're not seeking validation because you validate yourself. And you're not explaining your choices because they're no longer up for negotiation. Let them wonder. Let them scroll. Let them search for signs that the old you is still reachable. They won't find him. Because he served his purpose. He taught you what it means to give. And now, the version that remains? He teaches you what it means to protect. This is your era of emotional discipline. Of choosing your battles. Of choosing yourself. Not out of pride, but out of practice. Because every day you honor your own growth, you make peace louder than pain. You make presence more powerful than attention. You make Stoicism not just an idea, but a way of life. In the end, they won't miss you because of what you did. They'll miss you because of what you no longer do. You no longer respond. You no longer react. You no longer explain. And most of all, you no longer return to places where your presence was taken for granted. That's the shift. That's the silence. That's what stays. Not in anger, but in memory. Walk forward now. Without guilt. Without hesitation. Without waiting for acknowledgement. You've given enough. You've done enough. And now, your only obligation is to your own alignment. To the truth that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. You are your own closure. Your own peace. Your own presence. Let them feel what they chose not to see. Let them sit with the version of you they couldn't hold. And let your life be the quiet reminder that when a man truly evolves, he doesn't make noise, he makes distance. That's the story now. Not the ending they imagined, but the reality they created. And no matter how far they go, they'll carry the echo of the man who left without drama, without noise, and without regret. The man who simply outgrew the pattern and finally came home to himself.